California in the 1990s had the glitz, the glamour, the palm trees. But behind that sunshine veneer lurked shadows. In those years, some killers turned quiet suburbs and sunlit highways into stages for terror. Mothers whispered warnings. Teenagers locked bedroom doors. Entire communities speculated over letters, clues, rumors. Tonight, you'll hear the stories of the men whose names became nightmares, killers who slipped past police, taunted the media, evaded justice for years, or sometimes never paid. Who were they? How did they operate? And what secrets did they leave behind? From cryptic phone calls to chilling crime scenes, from vigilantes to bungled investigations. This is the dark side of 90s California. If you think you know the stories, stay tuned. You might be surprised at what you never heard before. The quiet suburb nightmare. Even in the early 90s, California still sold a dream. Golden beaches, fresh tech money, pastel houses with orange trees in the yard. But dreams can be perfect hiding places. While families planned backyard barbecues and late-night movie marathons, a different kind of plan was taking shape in the shadows. Someone was learning the rhythms of quiet streets, memorizing when porch lights blinked off and who forgot to lock their back doors. At first, the unease was tiny. A missing cat, a single scream that neighbors wrote off as a car backfiring, a late-night knock that nobody wanted to answer. But the feeling grew. People began to glance over their shoulders when carrying groceries in from the car. Police logs filled with odd reports. A window left open, a footprint in soft soil, a bicycle found on the wrong porch. Each thing alone seemed harmless. Together, they sketched a pattern. Detectives would later say that the real beginning of California's 90s nightmare was not a single crime scene. It was that creeping, shapeless fear. The idea that an invisible presence had started rehearsing long before the first confirmed murder. Criminal profilers call it the silent stage, when a predator perfects routes and tests doors without leaving evidence. For ordinary people, it simply felt like the air had changed, like summer nights had grown sharper somehow. This was a California on the cusp of big changes. New suburbs stretched into former farmland. Whole blocks went up in a season, filled with newcomers who barely knew their neighbors. Security systems were still rare, and cell phones had not yet become everyday shields. For someone who wanted to strike and vanish, the environment was close to perfect. The landscape itself seemed to help a hunter move unseen, slipping from crowded freeways to empty cul-de-sacs within minutes. Journalists at the time were busy chasing Hollywood scandals and political headlines. The slow build of scattered break-ins and unexplained disappearances did not yet make the front page. But on late-night talk radio and in neighborhood watch meetings, the whispers were getting louder. Some callers described a tall man in a dark sedan. Others swore they saw a shadow crossing backyards at the same hour every week. Whether those sightings were real or imagined hardly mattered. The sense of a hidden threat was very real. Looking back now, that uneasy atmosphere feels like a prologue written in invisible ink. It set the stage for multiple killers who would each bring their own method and madness. One of them would later be known as the Grim Sleeper, a name as haunting as the long pauses between his attacks. Another would drift across state lines, leaving confusion in his wake. They had nothing in common except a talent for vanishing and for turning ordinary places into scenes of dread. As the decade opened, California was still telling itself that these were isolated troubles, but a few detectives had begun to suspect something bigger. They noticed how certain neighborhoods kept reappearing in their files, how victims shared subtle patterns of age or routine. They didn't yet have a suspect. They barely had a theory. Still, their instincts told them that the state was standing on the edge of something dark. And they were right. The uneasy quiet of those early years was only the first act. Soon, the calm would break, and the name of one hidden killer would send shivers far beyond Los Angeles. His story begins next. The Grim Sleeper emerges. Long before his name appeared in headlines, a shadow moved through South Los Angeles. He blended so easily into the neighborhood that people later struggled to describe him. Was he the quiet man who fixed cars on weekends? The neighbor who always waved but never stayed to chat? In hindsight, almost anyone could have fit the memory, and that was part of his power. During the early 90s, when the city was still reeling from unrest and economic tension, this man used ordinary nights as cover. He drove familiar streets, sometimes parking just out of sight. He waited until a block was silent, until music from a distant party was the only sound. Then he acted. When morning came, a body might be found in an alley or behind a dumpster, sometimes hidden under trash or old furniture. Detectives would arrive to flashing lights and confuse neighbors, but real clues were scarce. The victims were mostly women, often from communities that faced hardship and limited resources. Some struggled with poverty or addiction, which meant their disappearances were not always given urgent attention. This imbalance worked in the killer's favor. Each time the news cycle moved on, he seemed to vanish with it. What made his pattern so chilling was the rhythm. After a burst of attacks, he could disappear for years. Those long pauses earned him a name that would later terrify Californians, the Grim Sleeper. Police believe he killed many times in the 90s, yet there were stretches of silence so long that some investigators wondered if he had died or moved away. In truth, he was living quietly, working regular jobs, and enjoying backyard barbecues, while families of the missing kept waiting for answers. Forensic science of that era struggled to keep up. DNA testing existed, but was far slower and less precise than today. Samples collected from crime scenes sat in evidence lockers while detectives chased traditional leads. Witnesses recalled a car that might have been blue, or maybe green. Someone thought they heard a gunshot. Someone else swore it was fireworks. Pieces of the puzzle kept arriving, but they never fit. The community's fear grew quietly. Parents reminded daughters to call home. Friends walked each other to bus stops, and shopkeepers installed extra lights. Yet the Grim Sleeper seemed untouchable. Years went by. Some cases grew cold enough to gather dust. Others were filed as isolated crimes, their connection hidden in plain sight. Meanwhile, the killer kept trophies, photographs, and personal items, proof of lives he had ended. Detectives would later find these collections and realize how many unknown victims might still be out there. Each image was a story cut short, a family left wondering. What finally changed the investigation was the steady progress of science. By the late 90s and early 2000s, DNA databases expanded. Old evidence could be tested with new methods. Slowly, matches began to appear. A single familial DNA lead taken from the killer's own son would eventually bring detectives to Lonnie David Franklin Jr., the man behind the Grim Sleeper name. But during the 90s themselves, he was still a ghost, watching and waiting while investigators circled in the dark. The Grim Sleeper's reign left lasting scars on Los Angeles. He showed how a predator could hide behind everyday normalcy, how whole communities could live side by side with danger without realizing it. His story set the template for a decade of fear, proving that even long silences could hold deadly secrets. And while Los Angeles struggled with this hidden nightmare, Another threat was already on the move, one that would not stay confined to a single city or even a single state. The next killer traveled highways and borderlines, turning mobility itself into a weapon. His trail begins in the next chapter. The two-state creeper imagine a stranger striking up a friendly chat at a roadside diner. He smiles easily, tells a quick joke, maybe offers to buy coffee. To everyone else, it's nothing unusual, just a drifter passing through. Yet behind the charm sits a restless darkness, one that will carry him from state to state, leaving investigators confused about where to look next. This is the world of Glenn Edward Rogers, later nicknamed the Cross-Country Killer. In the early 90s, when America's highways still felt open and unmonitored, Rogers used constant travel as both camouflage and hunting ground. He was not tied to one neighborhood like the Grim Sleeper. Instead, he treated the entire interstate system as a personal map of opportunity. Rogers grew up with turbulence and carried that chaos into adulthood. Friends remembered him as both charismatic and quick-tempered. He could strike up a friendship in minutes, which helped him gain trust, whether with someone he met in a bar, a motel lobby, or a small-town grocery store. That surface friendliness often disarmed people who might otherwise have been cautious. California became one of his key stops. He drifted in and out of the state, sometimes for work as a painter or handyman, sometimes for no reason he ever explained. The killings connected to him share certain threads: sudden encounters, quick escalations, and a disappearance that left families with only questions. Some victims were travelers themselves, people no one immediately missed. Others were locals drawn in by a stranger's easy talk. Tracking a killer like Rogers in the 90s was a logistical nightmare. Databases in different states rarely communicated. A suspicious death in Los Angeles might not be compared to a similar case in Mississippi or Florida for years. Rogers seemed to sense these gaps and exploit them. He would leave one city after a crime, blend into another, and pick up odd jobs that let him pay cash and stay invisible. Eventually, investigators in multiple states began comparing notes. DNA testing was still developing, but fingerprints, witness statements, and the emerging National Crime Database helped. Slowly, a pattern of sudden violence followed by long-distance travel became impossible to ignore. Rogers was arrested in the mid-90s and later convicted of several murders outside California. He even claimed boastfully, and not always credibly, that he had killed dozens more, including within the Golden State. Whether every claim was true remains debated, but what is certain is the fear his story spread. He reminded Californians that danger was not always local. A killer could drive across 3 states before sunrise, strike, and be gone again, before detectives knew which jurisdiction owned the case. The psychological impact was profound. People who once trusted long solo drives now looked twice at every stranger offering help with a flat tire. Truck stops and small motels installed better lighting and security cameras. Highway patrols began sharing information more aggressively. Rogers forced a shift in how law enforcement thought about mobility and crime. Even after his convictions, lingering questions remain. Did he exaggerate his victim count? Or are there still unlinked cases scattered across state lines? Some families still wonder if their unsolved losses connect to him, and detectives continue to revisit cold files with modern DNA tools. Rogers showed how a single person could stretch fear across an entire map. And while he prowled the highways, other predators stayed rooted in California, blending into neighborhoods in a different way. One of them was beginning to trouble the quiet communities of Orange County and beyond, a presence far closer to home. That story unfolds next. The Masked Horror in Orange County. It began with small, uneasy stories shared over backyard fences. A young woman never returned from an evening jog. A roommate came home to find a front door ajar and silence inside. Neighbors in Orange County wondered if these were coincidences, until detectives started comparing notes and realized that something more deliberate was at work. The killer who haunted these neighborhoods in the 90s was not a drifter passing through. He lived among the very people he hunted. Investigators would later link several of these brutal attacks to Michael Thomas Gargiulo, a man who seemed perfectly ordinary at first glance. Known later as the Hollywood Ripper, Gargiulo spent part of his early adult life in Southern California, and clues point to his presence in Orange County during a series of mysterious assaults and murders. At the time, nobody connected the dots. Gargiulo was young, personable, and could talk his way into almost any social circle. He often presented himself as a repairman or a helpful neighbor. That simple disguise let him learn the routines of those he targeted when they came home, when they turned off their porch lights, which windows might be unlocked on a warm evening. The crimes were carefully timed. Most happened late at night or in the earliest hours of morning, when streets were empty and even the most watchful neighbors were asleep. Victims were attacked in their own homes, places meant to be safe. The sudden violence shocked families and detectives alike. Scenes showed forced entry in some cases, but in others, doors appeared to have been left open, suggesting the attacker may have been invited in or used a subtle ruse to gain entry. Investigators faced a frustrating puzzle. Witness descriptions were vague. A tall man in a cap, a figure in a mask, seen only in the corner of a window. Physical evidence was thin. DNA analysis was still a young science and often produced inconclusive matches. Each new incident felt isolated until years later, when forensic advances began to reveal a pattern. Gargiulo's later confirmed crimes in the 2000s shed light backward on the 90s. Similar methods surprised nighttime attacks, careful surveillance, and quick escapes made detectives revisit unsolved cases from Orange County and nearby areas. Though some questions remain about exactly how many of those earlier crimes were his, many investigators believe his path of violence began in this era. The fear he inspired reshaped habits across Orange County. Hardware stores reported surges in sales of deadbolts and window locks. Community watch groups doubled their late-night patrols. Parents taught children to double-check doors and never open to strangers, even friendly ones offering help. The region learned how quickly a trusted neighborhood could feel unsafe. Years later, Gargiulo would face trial for multiple murders, and the evidence presented showed a chilling patience, detailed surveillance of victims, careful planning, and a disturbing ability to appear completely normal in daily life. These revelations only deepened the unease of those who remembered the unexplained attacks of the 90s. As California absorbed the shock of such homegrown danger, it became clear that some crimes would remain mysteries for years. Not every name would be discovered, and not every victim's story would immediately find justice. Across the state, investigators kept boxes of unsolved files marked pending, hoping that science or a sudden confession might someday bring clarity. Those silent boxes lead us into the next chapter, the cold cases that continue to haunt California, where questions still outnumber answers, and the trail is far from cold for the families who wait. The cold cases that haunt. Every detective has a drawer that never stays closed for long. Inside are files stamped unsolved, the cold cases. Each folder is a story with a missing ending. a mystery, waiting for the one clue that will finally speak. In California's 90s, these drawers began to overflow. Some of these mysteries started as routine missing person calls. A college student failed to show up for class. A grocery clerk didn't come home from an evening shift. At first, friends thought of late-night parties or a sudden trip. Days turned to weeks, and hope thinned. Without clear evidence of foul play, police could only file reports and keep watch. Years later, many of those names still remain on the missing list. Other cases began with scenes that were anything but quiet. A house left in perfect order, except for a single open window. A car found abandoned, with keys still in the ignition. Detectives gathered fibers, fingerprints, and whatever DNA techniques of the time could provide. But the science of the early 90s rarely gave quick or certain answers. Samples degraded. Labs were backlogged. Leads that might now be solved in weeks stretched into decades. These unsolved crimes left whole neighborhoods unsettled. Parents tightened curfews and accompanied children on bike rides. Night joggers chose new routes or stayed home entirely. The unknown can feel heavier than a named threat. People whispered theories. Perhaps the Grim Sleeper was responsible, or maybe a copycat. Without proof, every possibility seemed alive. Some cold cases carried haunting similarities. Victims might be of similar age or appearance, disappear on the same weekday, or live near a particular freeway. But patterns also misled. One detective might see a connection that another dismissed, and evidence rarely crossed city or county lines. California's sprawling geography worked against swift resolution. Occasionally, a letter or phone tip jolted an old case. Someone claimed to know a location of a body. Another said they recognized a suspect's face from a composite sketch. Many such leads turned out to be hoaxes or well-meaning mistakes. Yet detectives had to chase each one, never sure which might finally break the silence. Families of the missing lived in a limbo that words can barely describe. They organized their own searches, pinned flyers to telephone poles, and kept spare keys in case a loved one suddenly returned. Birthdays passed with empty chairs at the table. Some relatives kept the same phone number for decades, hoping a lost child might call. As the decade closed, new forensic tools began to change the landscape. DNA databases were expanding, and computer mapping allowed analysts to compare cases across counties. Some long-dormant files were re-examined with fresh eyes. Occasionally, a forgotten swab or a single hair revealed a genetic match that had been impossible to find before. Those moments brought both relief and fresh grief, confirming deaths but at least naming the lost. Still, many folders remain open even today. Each represents a person whose story has not yet reached justice. Detectives, both retired and active, keep those names alive, believing that science, persistence, or a future confession could still bring closure. Yet not every new development brought clarity. Some revelations only deepened the fog, when confessions turned out to be false or leads led nowhere. Those twists where hope surged and collapsed form the next chapter of California's dark 90s. Confessions and false leads. Picture: a weary detective late at night, coffee gone cold, when the phone finally rings. A man on the other end claims he knows who killed a missing woman. His voice shakes just enough to sound convincing. For a moment, everyone in the room feels that rare spark of hope. But by dawn, that hope may collapse, because in the 90s, California's most baffling cases often drew in people who loved attention more than truth. False confessions became a surprising obstacle throughout the decade. Some callers were pranksters seeking a quick thrill. Others were troubled individuals who wanted to feel important, even if it meant pretending to be killers. They studied newspaper articles, memorized small details, and rehearsed stories until they could sound chillingly real. Detectives would spend days chasing these leads, only to discover that timelines didn't match or key facts were wrong. Then there were those who confessed under pressure. In a time before every interrogation was recorded on video, long questioning sessions sometimes produced shaky statements. A frightened suspect might agree to anything just to end the ordeal. Later, DNA evidence often cleared them, but precious weeks or months had already been lost. One well-known pattern involved letters sent to newsrooms and police stations. Some were cryptic puzzles, others contained detailed descriptions of crimes. A few included objects that seemed to come from victims. Each letter demanded attention. Was it a genuine clue from the killer, or a hoax designed to mislead? Detectives had no choice but to treat every envelope as urgent. Forensic teams dusted paper for fingerprints, tested saliva on stamps, and compared handwriting, often to find nothing conclusive. Media attention added another layer of complexity. High-profile cases drew reporters who camped outside police headquarters and aired every rumor. Public tips poured in. Thousands of calls ranging from useful to absurd. An innocent man seen near a park could become a headline by nightfall. Detectives had to sift carefully, aware that a single wrong move could ruin lives and taint evidence. Despite the frustrations, these false leads were not meaningless. They sometimes revealed patterns about the real criminal. By watching who responded to press releases and how, investigators could narrow suspects. In rare cases, a hoaxer accidentally exposed knowledge only the killer would have. Yet more often, each dead end delayed justice and drained resources. Families of victims rode an emotional roller coaster. A confession brought sudden hope, perhaps an answer, perhaps a chance to bring a loved one home. When that confession proved false, the crash of disappointment was brutal. Still, many families chose to stay involved, attending every press conference, meeting with detectives, and keeping public attention alive. Their persistence often kept cases from slipping into silence. Meanwhile, real killers sometimes took advantage of the chaos. They watched the news, gauged police strategy, and adjusted their own movements. The swirl of half-truths and deliberate misdirection gave them valuable cover. It was a dark chess game in which every false confession became another move on the board. By the late 90s, advances in DNA profiling began to cut through some of this noise. Evidence could confirm or reject a confession with far more certainty than before. Old cases were revisited, and many innocent people were cleared. Yet even as technology improved, the human side of investigations, the need for patience, skepticism, and careful listening remained vital. Out of this maze of dead ends and deceptive voices emerged a handful of solid cases that finally reached the courtroom. These trials drew crowds, shaped law enforcement policy, and kept Californians glued to nightly news updates. One case in particular would dominate headlines and reveal how justice and spectacle can intertwine. That story unfolds in the next chapter. The trial that shook LA courtrooms are usually quiet places, but during the late 90s in Los Angeles, one trial turned the downtown courthouse into a stage that the whole nation watched. Crowds lined the steps each morning, reporters filled every bench. Television trucks kept their cameras ready for the slightest development. Inside, lawyers and witnesses faced a sea of flashing lights, and questions shouted from the hallway. It felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a high-stakes drama. This chapter of California's dark decade centers on the long path from crime scene to verdict. Years of investigation, false leads, and patient evidence gathering finally brought a suspect to trial for a string of violent murders. For families who had waited so long, each court date carried both relief and dread. They would hear painful details repeated in open court, but they also hoped for justice that had seemed impossible. The case combined everything that captures public imagination: mysterious disappearances, careful forensic work, and a defendant who maintained a calm, almost detached presence. Prosecutors laid out a timeline built from small but stubborn fax fibers on clothing, traces of DNA preserved in sealed envelopes, maps that showed how each victim's life had briefly intersected with the accused. Each piece on its own was modest. Together, they formed a picture that jurors could not ignore. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, challenged every link in the chain. They questioned lab methods, argued that evidence was contaminated, and pointed to the years of delay as proof of doubt. At times, they suggested alternative suspects, feeding headlines that speculated wildly about hidden accomplices or secret motives. The courtroom became a daily duel between two narratives, one of careful guilt, another of persistent uncertainty. For the families of victims, testifying was the hardest moment. Parents, siblings, and friends spoke of loved ones' daily habits, their favorite foods, their last phone calls. These personal memories gave life to names that had too often been reduced to case numbers. Their voices reminded everyone that behind the legal language of exhibits and evidence were human stories cut short. Outside, the trial reshaped public conversation. Talk shows dissected testimony, late-night comedians referenced the case, and ordinary people debated forensic science over coffee. The growth of 24-hour news meant that every argument and recess reached homes across the country almost instantly. Californians, who once only caught headlines in morning papers, now watched the drama unfold in real time. After weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. Hours stretched into days. Reporters camped on the courthouse lawn, broadcasting each small rumor a meal delivered to the jury room. A sudden call for more coffee, as if it were a sign of the verdict to come. When the decision finally arrived, the room held its breath. The guilty verdict brought a wave of emotion. For families, there was the bittersweet comfort of closure. For detectives and prosecutors, it was confirmation that years of patient work had not been in vain. Yet no sentence could undo the losses or fully answer why these crimes occurred. The courtroom victory, while important, marked only a partial end. This landmark trial also changed how California approached future investigations. It highlighted the need for stronger evidence preservation, clearer communication between agencies, and better support for victims' families. Lessons learned in this case influenced how police and labs handled DNA, fingerprints, and cross-county data for years to come. But the story of fear and endurance did not end at the courthouse doors. After the verdict, communities still had to rebuild a sense of safety. Survivors, neighbors, and loved ones carried the memories forward, shaping how an entire region thought about night walks, locked doors, and trust itself. And as the courtroom lights dimmed, attention turned outward from the drama of a single trial to the broader aftermath. How do survivors and neighborhoods begin to heal when the news cameras leave? The next chapter follows that quiet but powerful journey. Aftermath and survivors. When the verdicts were read and the cameras packed up, a different kind of story began, one without bright lights or front-page headlines. It was the slow, personal work of healing. For survivors of violence in California's 90s, and for the families of those who never came home, the aftermath stretched far beyond a single court decision. The first days after a trial often brought a strange quiet. Reporters who had once crowded the courthouse disappeared. Neighbors, unsure what to say, sometimes avoided the topic altogether. Yet for families, the absence of daily updates did not mean peace. Empty chairs at dinner, unopened letters, birthdays marked only in memory. These small moments kept the loss painfully present. Support groups became lifelines. In church basements and community centers, parents and siblings met others who truly understood. They traded stories of late-night phone calls from detectives and the complicated feelings that followed a guilty verdict. Many spoke of sudden waves of anger or sorrow that came without warning. Sharing these experiences slowly turned isolation into connection. Communities, too, had to find new footing. Streets once known for easy evening strolls were now lined with motion lights and security cameras. Neighborhood watch programs grew stronger and more organized. People learned to recognize warning signs and to check on each other more often. What began as fear gradually evolved into a culture of mutual care. Some survivors chose public advocacy. They pushed for better resources for missing person investigations, stronger evidence storage laws, and victim compensation funds. Their testimonies helped California improve how police handle cold cases and how courts support those affected by violent crime. These changes were hard-won and often took years, but they have saved lives and given future families a clearer path to justice. Others found healing in quieter ways. They planted memorial gardens, wrote letters to loved ones, or created scholarships in victims' names. Each gesture became a way to reclaim space from violence and to ensure that the people lost were remembered for their lives, not just the way they died. The impact on mental health was profound and lasting. Counselors working with survivors of the 90s noted patterns of anxiety, sleeplessness, and sudden panic in crowds or empty parking lots. Over time, therapy and peer support helped many regain a sense of everyday safety. The resilience of these individuals stands as a quiet but powerful counterpoint to the violence that changed their lives. For law enforcement, the aftermath also carried lessons. Detectives who had spent years on these cases often struggled with burnout and lingering stress. Departments began offering more counseling and training on trauma, understanding that those who investigate violence also need care. By the dawn of a new millennium, California looked different. DNA testing had advanced, databases were stronger, and public awareness of safety had sharpened. Yet many families still waited for news. They believed that science might someday unlock answers hidden for years. That belief was not misplaced. As technology moved forward, cold case units and forensic breakthroughs started to breathe life back into long, silent files. The promise of DNA, once just a hope, became a powerful tool for justice. The next chapter explores how those scientific leaps began to change everything, turning decades-old mysteries into solvable puzzles. DNA, cold case units, and breakthroughs. At the turn of the millennium, California's evidence rooms were treasure chests waiting to be reopened. Inside lay envelopes of hair, sealed swabs, and carefully labeled clothing collected during the 90s. For years, these items had offered only faint clues. But science was catching up, and what once seemed silent was about to speak. During the early 90s, DNA testing was slow and limited. Samples had to be large and nearly pristine. A single drop of dried blood or a hair without a root often wasn't enough. But by the late 90s and early 2000s, new methods like short tandem repeat analysis allowed scientists to work with tiny, aged samples. Evidence that had slept in cold storage suddenly became active again. Specialized cold case units began to form across California. Detectives and forensic analysts combed through old files, matching forgotten samples to new technology. They prioritized cases that seemed solvable with fresh tools: unsolved murders, mysterious disappearances, long-dormant sexual assaults. Each reopened folder felt like a second chance for justice. The results were remarkable. Crimes once thought untraceable started to yield names. A speck of skin under a victim's fingernail could now reveal an entire genetic code. In several landmark cases, suspects who had lived quietly for decades were finally identified. Some were arrested at workplaces or family homes, stunned that a crime from the 90s had followed them into middle age. These breakthroughs often began with a single DNA hit. California was among the first states to build a large genetic database of convicted offenders. When a new sample matched someone already in the system, or a close relative, the chain of secrecy snapped. Investigators could link crimes across counties, connecting cases that once seemed unrelated. Familial DNA searches became a game changer. Even when the killer had never been arrested, a match with a sibling, parent, or child could point detectives in the right direction. This technique eventually helped close cases like that of the Grim Sleeper, proving that patient evidence collection decades earlier had not been in vain. The emotional effect on families was profound. After years of waiting, some finally received the call they had almost stopped hoping for. They learned the names of those responsible, attended long-delayed trials, and placed long-missing pieces into their life stories. For others, even a confirmed identification brought complex feelings, relief at answers, but grief renewed. DNA technology also reshaped how new investigations were handled. Crime scene units became more meticulous, knowing that even a single cell could later provide crucial evidence. Police training emphasized careful packaging and digital cataloging so future scientists would have every possible advantage. Yet the science carried new challenges. Courts debated privacy issues around genetic data. Defense attorneys questioned how to handle complex family matches. Legislators worked to balance civil liberties with the drive to solve violent crimes. Each debate showed how powerful and personal DNA evidence had become. Despite the successes, many cases still waited. Not every sample yielded a clear profile, and not every killer had a relative in the database. But hope had changed shape. What once felt like permanent mystery now felt like a puzzle waiting for the right key. And as investigators celebrated long-awaited arrests, they knew their work was not done. Some killers from the 90s had never even been identified, let alone caught. The question lingered in every briefing room. How many remain out there, living ordinary lives while their crimes stay hidden? That unsettling possibility leads us into the next chapter, those who may still be at large. Still at large. Even as science advanced and celebrated arrests filled headlines, another truth kept detectives awake at night. Some killers from California's 90s have never been found. Their names remain unknown, their faces unrecognized, their stories only partially told through evidence that has yet to yield a full match. Picture a small evidence locker in a suburban police station. Inside, carefully sealed boxes hold clothing fibers, fragments of rope, maybe a single hair collected under a victim's fingernail. Each sample is a whisper from the past. Investigators revisit these boxes again and again, hoping that the next technological leap or a lucky tip will finally speak the name of a hidden suspect. Some of these mysteries are tied to a single crime scene, a lone disappearance, a sudden death with no clear suspect. Others suggest patterns, similar methods, matching time frames, and geographical clusters that hint at a serial predator who was never caught. Detectives debate whether certain unsolved murders across Los Angeles, the Bay Area, and inland counties might connect, even if the evidence is not yet conclusive. The reasons these killers remain unidentified vary. In some cases, crucial DNA degraded before modern methods could preserve it. In others, the killer may have left no biological trace at all, relying on gloves, fire, or sheer luck. A few likely changed their appearance, or moved far from California, vanishing into new communities where no one suspects their past. Families of the victims live in a delicate balance between hope and resignation. They keep photos on mantles and numbers saved in their phones, waiting for a detective's unexpected call. Many participate in online forums, where amateur sleuths share theories and track every small update. Some even provide voluntary DNA samples, hoping a distant genetic link might eventually crack the case. Law enforcement agencies continue to revisit these cold files. New mapping software highlights patterns that once went unseen. Forensic genealogists search family trees for partial matches. Investigators collaborate with national and even international databases since a suspect might have crossed borders long ago. Every few months, an old case gains fresh attention. When a single clue, an anonymous tip, a newly testable sample brings the possibility of progress. The unresolved nature of these cases also carries a wider social weight. They remind Californians that justice can be patient, but not guaranteed. They highlight the importance of community vigilance and the need for constant improvement in forensic science. Each unsolved mystery is both a challenge and a call to keep memory alive. And so, while many killers of the 90s have faced courtroom justice, a shadow remains. Somewhere, men or women who committed terrible crimes may still walk unnoticed among us, living quiet lives that mask violent pasts. Detectives know that time can both hide and reveal, and they continue to watch for the one event, a casual DNA test by a relative, a sudden confession, or a forgotten item in an attic that could finally close these chapters. Yet this story is not only about the unknown. It is also about what society has learned from decades of investigation, how entire communities have changed because of those dark years. As we move toward the final chapter, we turn from mystery to meaning, asking what these tragedies have taught California about resilience, justice, and the enduring strength of those who refuse to forget. Lessons from Darkness. The story of California's 90s killers is more than a catalogue of crimes. It is a long, uneasy lesson about how communities respond to fear and how determination can outlast even the most patient predator. When the decade began, few could imagine how deeply these cases would change everyday life. When it ended, almost every corner of the state had felt the impact. One lesson came from science. The slow, careful work of collecting evidence in the 90s, sometimes with little hope of quick results, became the foundation for later breakthroughs. Each cotton swab sealed in a paper envelope, each photograph carefully filed, gave future investigators something to build on. Today's fast genetic matching owes much to those early habits of patience and precision. Another lesson lies in community strength. Neighborhood watch groups, support circles, and volunteer search teams proved that ordinary people can make a lasting difference. When official investigations stalled, families and neighbors kept asking questions, holding vigils, and sharing information. Their persistence often kept cases alive until technology or a new lead could take over. The decade also revealed how the justice system must evolve. High-profile trials showed the importance of transparent procedures, recorded interrogations, and resources for victims' families. Laws on evidence handling, cold case funding, and victim compensation all grew stronger because of the hard experiences of those years. These changes continue to protect Californians today. Perhaps the deepest lesson is about memory. Time can dim details, but it can also sharpen resolve. Families who refused to forget kept stories in the public eye. Journalists revisited cold cases, filmmakers documented survivors' experiences, and new generations of detectives studied old files. Together, they proved that remembrance itself can be a form of justice. For many Californians, daily habits also shifted in quiet but lasting ways. People became more cautious about doors and windows, more aware of neighbors, more willing to share concerns with local police. These changes, while subtle, created a culture of safety and mutual care that still shapes neighborhoods across the state. None of this erases the pain. The lives lost in the 90s cannot be restored, and some mysteries remain unresolved. Yet the resilience shown by families, investigators, and entire communities offers its own kind of strength. It tells us that even in the face of calculated violence, compassion and persistence can endure. As we close this journey, the sunlight and shadows of California stand side by side. The same state known for beaches and movie dreams also carries the weight of unfinished stories and hard-earned wisdom. Remembering those years is not only about the darkness, it is about the courage that rose to meet it. The echoes of the 90s still call out in unsolved files and family memories. But they also speak through safer streets, stronger laws, and the quiet determination of people who refuse to let violence have the final word. These are the lessons left to us, a reminder that while evil can hide for a time, it cannot escape a community that keeps watch and keeps caring.